Amen. So let me go ahead and once again say Happy Father's Day, right? Thank you to all the dads, all that you add to our lives. One of my favorite memories of my dad, real quick, when I was like 6 months old or something, he would hold chocolate-covered peanuts and just like let me lick the chocolate off. And my mom would be like, "What are you doing? He could choke." And my dad's like, I'm a grown man. I'm pretty sure I can hold a peanut such that my son can't, take it away. So fond memory there. Let me also just acknowledge that I know for some, Father's Day or this Father's Day might be harder, right? And so I just wanted to acknowledge just the reality that it varies. And I pray that whether today is a day of pure excitement or some difficulty, that you would experience God's presence today. So if you'll indulge me, I wanted to start off by talking about two things that I'm pretty sure dads are required to love at least one of, and that is sports and Star Wars. I'm pretty sure a dad has to love at least one, if not both of those. I don't know how that's tested or required, but it's at least one of those, right? But one of the things that sports and Star Wars have in common, actually, rivalries, right? There's enemies in both of those. Think about sports. You've got the Lakers and the Celtics. You've got the Yankees, the Red Sox. You've got the Chiefs and literally anyone else, right? That seems to be the vibe these days, right? And then in Star Wars, the Jedi, the Sith, the Empire, the Rebels, right? These rivalries, these disputes and enemies in media, in sports, are fun. They're incredible. Sometimes it's more fun to root against a team than to root for a team, right? I think we've all had that experience. Once again, the Chiefs, right? We've all had that experience where it is more fun to do that. But here's the thing. That's great in entertainment. That's not great when it's our life. That's not great when it's right in front of us. So, for instance, the musical Hamilton, if any of you have experienced that, based on, Alexander Hamilton, what actually happened to him, ends with the duel between him and his rival, Aaron Burr. Spoilers, I'm sorry, but it's hundreds of years ago, you're fine. It ends, Alexander Hamilton dies, Aaron Burr loses any chance of political career because he just killed Alexander Hamilton. No one won, right? No one won in that instance. Or another famous American rivalry, the Hatfields and the McCoys, right? The classic West Virginia families that were constantly rivals, that were constantly fighting, killing one another. What was gained? Nothing, right? At the end, nothing was really gained from that. And that kind of dispute, that kind of rivalry and fighting against one another is where we find the Corinthian church, right? That's what Paul is writing to address among the Corinthians, as there's all these disputes going on, and they're taking each other to court pretty constantly, it sounds like. And so the main point for this morning, the main point that I think this passage has for us that God wants us to take away is that believers are to value our relationships with one another more than our rights or being right. Believers are to value our relationships with one another more than our rights or being right. So at the end of chapter 5, right before this, what we covered last week, Paul talks about those inside the church and those outside. He talks specifically about how God is the one who will judge those outside the church. But we as believers, we can look inside the church, right? We can and should be concerned about what's going on inside the church. And starting this passage, that's where we find ourselves. So jumping to verse 1, if any of you has a dispute with another, do you dare to take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the Lord's people? Or do you not know that the Lord's people will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Right? Pretty clearly, the Corinthians are having disputes. They're having arguments with one another. And one of the things that stood out to me is in chapter 5, right, that case of incest that starts off the chapter, Paul is very specific. He's uber specific, which makes it seem like a one-time incident. Here's one thing that has occurred. But here, this seems like a general thing. This is a trend. This is something that is continuing to happen, right? The Corinthians are a people, they're a culture that care deeply for what they think is theirs. And the way that they would commonly express that was, hey, you just take people to court. It's just a normal thing to do there. And Paul is saying, no way. That's not what believers should be doing, right? So I'm an only child. Hopefully that wasn't too painfully obvious, but I'm an only child, and I know that families fight, right? Like, I'm aware that families fight. Do I know that because I hang out with friends that had siblings? Yes, but I also occasionally fought with my parents, that kind of thing. One of the things that I learned from that experience, though, yes, all families fight, right? That's just families fight, period. That's the statement. But if I got in trouble at a friend's house, discipline and rules and expectations were different. If a friend got in trouble at my house, discipline and rules and expectations were different. And that's part of why Paul is so deeply concerned. Because for the family of God, right, for the family of believers, the way that things should be settled, the expectations, the things that matter are different. And so the believers are not handling those in their house, in our own house. They're exporting them. They're taking them to the law room. They're taking them to the courthouse down the street. And that's a problem. That is a problem. And so the first point in your notes is believers are to resolve our issues with one another. Believers are to resolve our issues with one another. And I think from this passage already, I hope that's pretty clear to you. So one thing that we should really take note of is the end of verse 2, where it says trivial cases, right? These are small matters, okay? These are small, trivial civil lawsuits, right? So let me press pause and say, there is a moment where it is probably the most God-glorifying, where it is probably the best for Christians to engage with other Christians in a law room, right? There's a moment as it relates to abuse, harassment, various other serious cases where that's probably the most God-glorifying. And yet here, this is not that, right? Let's be apparent. This is not what is going on right now. This is property line disagreements. This is a kid breaking a window and their parent refusing to acknowledge that their little angel could ever do such a thing, right? These are the kind of disagreements and arguments going on here. These are small matters, right? So when we have these difficulties, if it's not going to the law room, if it's not filing a lawsuit, which I hope is not your first method of resolving conflict, I'm really glad I'm not in your family immediately if that is, but how do we resolve that? Jesus actually talks about that, right? Plenty of places, but specifically we're going to flip to Matthew chapter 5, right? So this is in the Sermon on the Mount, and verses 23, 24 are in the section where Jesus talks about murder. Specifically in that, though, he says, hey, if you're angry with your brother or sister, that's the same. And so verse 23 says, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift, right? So here, Jesus connects disputes with our brothers and sisters to our worship, right? He instructs those listening to him to pause their offering of a gift at the altar, which is a sacrifice pretty equivalent to us worshiping at church today. He encourages them to pause that, to go and to reconcile with that other person before they come back, before they continue. So maybe that relates to how you and I think about communion today, for instance. But the thing that I think is really of note is in verse 23 where Jesus says, so you're there, you're worshiping, you're ready doing your thing, and you remember that someone has something against you. He doesn't say whether it's right or wrong. He doesn't make any judgment on it. He just says, so you're there, you're worshiping, and you know, hey, wait, my friend, my brother, whoever, is actually upset with me. I need to go resolve that. I need to go remedy that so that then I might come back and worship rightfully. That's so different to how we think today, right? I feel like that's so different to how I think today, at least. And I'd say for a lot of us, it is so vastly different. So, as much as possible, as it comes to issues for us and other believers, we need to resolve them with those people, to sit down, to work through them together. And at times, maybe you do need to bring in a third party. Maybe that's, a pastor, a neutral person. At points, maybe you even need to bring in a lawyer just to understand the full implications of what's going on in a scenario, right? Like maybe that's the best way forward. But the decision, the ultimate decision, still needs to be made between believers in-house with that proper understanding of those rules, that proper understanding of those expectations, right? And so amidst this, right, Paul is talking about these trivial cases and just how much Christians have authority, how much we have power, what we will judge. And that's where verse 3 comes in. Do you not know that we will judge angels? We will judge angels. How much more the things of this world, right? Judging angels, that's its own thing that we could spend a lot of time on. The point is, at the end, believers alongside God will help judge fallen angels, right? It's not the most important point. The point Paul is making that we need to notice, that we need to walk away with today is this is how much authority we have as believers. These are the kind of judgments that we can make. So why are they engaging in the lunacy of going to court? Why are they engaging in having a judge who is not a Christian, not any association with Jesus, make these decisions for them? If they can judge over fallen angels, come on, you can decide what to do about someone's broken lawnmower, right? That is a decision in the realm of possibility for us. And that's where verse 4 kind of comes in as this sucker punch almost when it says, therefore, if you have disputes about such matters, do you ask for a ruling from those whose way of life is scorned in the church, right? If you were here last week or have been here recently, Paul has talked ultimately very kindly about those outside of the church, right? Verses 12 and 13 that I mentioned earlier from chapter 5, he just says, those outside the church. That's a very kind way to mention someone who doesn't follow Jesus. Or at the start of chapter 6, the ungodly. Cool. There you go. That is a very kind way. And yet, the seriousness of Paul's language here in verse 4, do you ask for a ruling from those whose way of life is scorned in the church? That's a lot stronger than the ungodly. That's a lot stronger than those outside the church, right? And that's meant to capture their attention. That's meant to capture our attention, to point out just how far the Corinthians are falling from the gospel, how far they're falling from actually living that out. And so that's the second point for today. Believers are called to be forgivers. Believers are called to be forgivers, right? So much of what Jesus says in the Gospels relates in one way or another to forgiveness. Even in the Lord's Prayer, right? Where verse 12 of Matthew 6, right? So this is the Lord's Prayer. Most Bibles, the Lord's Prayer is like 10 lines, right? 2 of those are about forgiveness, and verse 12 says, and forgive us our debts as we have also forgiven our debtors, right? So as we're praying to God, asking for forgiveness, asking that he would forgive us all the ways we have sinned, all the ways that we have fallen short. And Jesus giving this as instruction, suggesting, hey, this should be regular. This should be a normal occurrence, right? And I think most of us recognize that on average, but also, as we have also forgiven our debtors, right? So there, the onus is put back on us once again to be people who forgive, to be people who forgive others readily, willingly, and who seek others forgiving us, right? So that forgiveness constantly vertical, but then horizontal, right? Us pursuing others and asking forgiveness, but then asking them to forgive us, right? And I think one of the points here to really keep mind of is just how different the conduct is supposed to be at any point in human history between those inside the church and those outside the church. There should be a vast difference. And in this moment, the Corinthians were not living into that. In this moment, the Corinthians were setting a bad example. This is not a community I would want to be a part of. If there was a decent chance that someone would sue me regularly, that's not really a group of people I want to hang around with. I imagine for most of us, that's not the case, right? And yet, that's the reality of where the Corinthians are at. They're not offering that forgiveness to one another. They're not living out and remembering the gospel. And that should be a concern for all of us. So Paul is so exasperated by these lawsuits. And that's where verse 5 and 6 come in, right? Verse 5, I say this to shame you. Is it possible that there is nobody among you wise enough to judge a dispute between believers? But instead, one brother takes another to court, and this in front of unbelievers. Earlier in the book of 1 Corinthians, if you guys were here, maybe you remember. If not, that's okay. Earlier in the book, at one point, Paul says, I don't write this to shame you, I write this to warn you, right? He specifically said, hey, I'm not writing this to make you feel bad, I'm writing this because I'm concerned. Here, he says, I say this to shame you. I say this to make you feel bad and realize what you're doing, right? Especially back then, for any honor-shame culture like this or somewhere else in the world, right? This is gonna resonate. This is going to stop the conversation. People are going to notice and feel the weight of this. This is the level of seriousness, right? As we read it today, this doesn't seem like that big of a matter, but it's a problem for one, how believers are actually living out the gospel, and two, for the example it's setting to the community. Paul wants them to think seriously about what they're doing. There are certain conflicts in human history, maybe even in our lives, that require going to court, that require serious negotiation, right? I think of any major war and the negotiations that happen to decide what's going on, to decide how land will be distributed, to decide reparations, any of those things. There's moments where that needs to happen, where that does happen. That's kind of what the Corinthians think is going on. That kind of where what the Corinthians think they're doing and the level of seriousness. I think I would argue, it's more akin to back in elementary school when you would trade at lunch, right? And every day you'd have to decide the conversion rate between goldfish and chocolate milk and apple slices and the weird pudding cup that only a few kids actually like. Those were not very valuable, right? That's a lot more akin to the disputes that the believers here are having, right? They think that they're doing these incredible negotiations, these world-shattering things. You're a kid, you're a 7-year-old going for goldfish. Come on, it's not that big of a deal, right? And Paul is writing this to humble them, to help them realize, lower them a peg and say, it's not that important. And that's where verses 7 and 8, the climax of this passage, building on all of this and highlighting the way forward for the Corinthians, the way forward for us today, comes in. The very fact that you have lawsuits among you means you have been completely defeated already. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Instead, you yourselves cheat and do wrong, and you do this to your brothers and sisters. All right? And so directly from that comes our third point for today. Believers need to be okay being wronged and cheated. We as believers need to be okay being wronged and cheated. Once again, the language in this passage gets incredibly strong. These lawsuits mean that they have been completely defeated already. There's no chance of victory. This is go straight to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200 in Monopoly. This is a team of 7-year-olds showing up to play France for the World Cup, right? The team of 7-year-olds, they're not going to score. They're not going to do anything, right? It is complete and utter defeat is the reality of what's going on here for the Corinthians, right? Is that how deeply we care about our unity as a church body? Is that how deeply we care about our relationships with one another and the status of our church? Jesus did, right? In John chapter 13, verse 35, right? As he is speaking to his disciples before later that night, he'll be crucified, right? Some of his last words to the disciples, he says, "By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." That's how people will know that we are Jesus' disciples, by our love for one another, by our care for one another. Is our love that remarkable? Is it that distinct? This kind of looking out for our own rights and what we might even be able to say we deserve, right? Some of these lawsuits were probably incredibly valid. We're probably incredibly accurate and got someone what they deserved, got them money back, got them whatever they needed. But it fails to acknowledge, one, just how much God has forgiven us. It fails to remember the gospel. It fails to remember our constant need for forgiveness. And two, it fails to remember the reality that we are to love one another. These kinds of lawsuits, this kind of bickering in a community, it's not that love. It's not that care for one another. Instead, Paul calls for us to be willing to be wronged, to be willing to be cheated. Our relationships with one another in this room are so much more important than whatever it might be. As I was studying to get ready for this morning, I ran across this quote by Barclay that I wanted to share that I think is incredibly, one, convicting, but also helpful in summarizing this passage. It says, "If the Christian has even the remotest tinge of the love of Christ within his heart, he will rather suffer insult and loss and injury and damage than try to inflict them on someone else, still more so if that person is a brother." I don't know that any of us in this room are necessarily threatening one another with lawsuits, and if that is the case, I just made it slightly awkward for some people. But I don't really think for most of us, we're in danger of that. I don't think that's where our mind turns. And yet, us as average Americans still care a lot about our rights, still care a lot about the things that we consider to be ours, right? The kind of unity Paul is calling us to as believers, the kind of unity that we should long to see grow and be exhibited in our church, is not the kind that happens when you're watching a TV show or a movie. And I think of like any Lampoon Vacation movie, right? Any of those, and you're just waiting for things to go wrong. You're just waiting for them to start fighting. You're just waiting, or The Office, right? Waiting for something to go wrong. You know Michael Scott is going to do something offensive and ridiculous, and it's just, how long is it going to take for it to happen this episode? That's not the kind of family gatherings. That's not the kind of church that we're wanting, that we're longing for in terms of unity, where it's just anxious and you're like, all right, as long as you don't mention this, as long as no one says this, we'll be okay. That's not unity. That's not the picture that we're longing for. So as it relates back to that quote, right? Suffering insult and loss and injury and damage. As it relates to your life, where might that show up, right? What might someone not be able to say about you or when someone says that thing about you, and your blood starts to boil and it starts to rise, and maybe you're kind of like me. I'm not an angry person. I just get irritated or frustrated or annoyed. Okay, sounds like you get angry, and it's just not like blowing off the kettle, all right? It's not going to explode, but you're gonna be irked. But what are those moments? What do you do when someone scratches your car in the parking lot? Like how much of a concern is that for you? Growing up, my parents cared a lot about their cars. Like the new car, we'd always park at the very back of the parking lot. Like we'd walk more steps in the Target parking lot to get into the building than actually in the building, because my parents cared that much, and I imagine for my dad, that might have been one of the ones. And then he said, you can't care too much, because otherwise you're just going to go miserable. You're going to be miserable. But what are those things? What are those moments for you where you don't want to suffer insult? You don't want to suffer loss. You don't want to be injured. You don't want to be damaged. And maybe it's not you, but your kids or your spouse or what people say about your family. I think of the classic, I can talk bad about my hometown or my family because it's mine, but as soon as you say something, you're in trouble, right? Maybe it's that for you. But I think for all of us today, I'm glad we're not really concerned about the lawsuits, right? But maybe even just the quiet frustration, the thing that burns in you and starts to build such that you're just going to avoid that person at church. You just don't want to talk to them, and you can say hi and be somewhat kind, but man, you really don't want to have to sit across the table from them or have an extended interaction or whatever it might be. I don't know what those things are for you, and maybe that's something just to sit and ponder, but that's what we need to submit to God. That's a place where we need to seek forgiveness, where we don't want to be a church that has been completely defeated already, right? We instead want to be a model to the world, to be a light, and I think how we live in these walls is part of that. Let me pray for us this morning. God, we just say thank you. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the way that it cuts and convicts and calls each of us out as we need uniquely. God, I just pray for each one of us, Lord, however you might have challenged or convicted or called us out or even just given us a question or an area of our lives that we need to think about. I do just pray, God, that you would help us to be faithful, to respond faithfully. Lord, I pray that you would help us to be a church marked by love, marked by genuine unity, genuine care for one another, such that, Lord, that in and of itself is a light, is an example to those around us that makes people want to know you, that makes people curious. God, Lord, just bless each of us as we leave here today. Help us to go and to walk faithfully with you this upcoming week. Jesus, it's in your name we pray. Amen.